Okay, good evening, class. They're a very lively looking bunch, Ed. All right, well, a pleasure to join you this evening. I'm going to go fairly quickly through about 6 slides, which I hope will give you some insights into some of the real-world applications and challenges faced by emergency and crisis responders. At the end of the slides, I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to go fairly quick through content and really just touch on things. So if it's something that you really are interested in and you'd like more discussion, don't hesitate to jump in at the end of the discussion. You should be seeing a slide now with an outline. This is essentially just the 7 questions that Ed gave me in prep for this interview. I'm not going to read them through here, just I'm going to reassure you I'm going to try and touch on each of those questions and hopefully we'll provoke some interesting discussion later at the mention. Okay, and also in trying to complement your course content, I'm going to be as applied as possible in some of my observations and comments. In particular, I'm looking at large-scale disaster response operations, and I'm going to give you some first-hand experiences that I had working as a manager connected to the big earthquake in Nepal in 2015, the West Africa Gulf outbreak in 2014-15, and also the big Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. I've been involved for the last almost 20 years, almost every major humanitarian disaster and crisis globally. So if you have questions on other disasters and responses to those, I'm also happy to try and comment. I'm also going to try and highlight what I think might be some interesting challenges and opportunities where improved crisis informatics can have a real impact going forward, say, the next 10 years. And I'm naturally cynical and a questioning person, so you'll hear my reflections come through what comes next. Are we good, Ed? Can I move into it?
Yes, please do.
All right. So there's a number of Ed's questions touched on the area of planning and training. And for all of our best intentions, we use what we call the peacetime, the period between major disasters, to really focus on disaster preparedness and aspects of preparing staff, partners, communities to be able to cope with the impacts of a major disaster or crisis. A lot of that will often be coalesced in a contingency plan. And a contingency plan, I'm sure you've heard the term, can be a document developed around disaster crisis scenario from a local level to a national level, a regional level, even to a global level. And within the plan, there's an attempt to quantify and qualify who will do what, where, when, and how response will work and what particular measures need to be taken in peacetime in order to make the response to a disaster efficient, effective, and ideally save as many lives and livelihoods as possible. To do that, we often focus our training on staff who are likely to be in the front line, the coalface as we call it, and they will be a range of technical managerial skills necessary for managing a complicated or a complex disaster that happens. We also focus at a global level on developing surge capacity. Surge capacity is a standby team of people with skills that are easily transferable across many contexts. And for efficiency's sake, it doesn't make sense to have a very large team available in every country of the world to respond to large disasters that might only come by every 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years. There's some greater efficiencies and effectiveness in having teams that are able to travel at very short notice and take experience lessons learned from other operations into a major disaster response operation very quickly. So globally, the humanitarian actors invest quite a lot in training surge teams and developing surge capacity as an efficient and effective way of complementing local, national response mechanisms. Another key tool around planning and training is simulation exercises, or SimEx. By their very nature, they tend to work with scenarios that are manageable. And that is important in that it makes the exercise achievable or successful, but it tends to also breed complacency that when disasters strike, they will be manageable. And that we will be able to, in many regards, use existing SOPs, use existing good practical best practice approaches to respond. And as we'll talk about in relation to some of these major disasters experienced in the world over the last few decades, that's very much not always the case. Something I think also worth touching upon, and I mentioned this to Ed prior to this discussion today, is the importance of International Disaster Response Law, or IDRL. Disaster laws are an attempt to enshrine soft law or even hard law countries a framework for operating in a time of crisis. So this would be agreed roles and responsibility between actors with the state, with the government's military, with the government's own political and administrative structures to enable actors like the Red Cross or NGOs or the UN have a formalized role in responding, and also have waivers on some of the things that can hold us up, such as customs and excise on equipment and supplies that we're bringing in for response, or pre-qualifying medical personnel to be able to come in and work in a particular country, not having held up on the border with a question on their skills and competency for being able to respond. This links to the next point around investing in choosing partners of choice, choosing preferred partners in peacetime, and having it very clear with other partners how you will or will not work. A classic conundrum in this area is the role of militaries in responding to humanitarian emergencies or crises. The humanitarian actors have established standards, protocol, rules which seek to separate humanitarian response from a military response to a disaster. And that's important in terms of security personnel, in terms of being able to access populations affected, and in terms of the quality and the approaches taken to distributing humanitarian aid in a way that doesn't discriminate or a way that doesn't exacerbate divisions with communities. So there's a real skill around how you deliver humanitarian aid that aid practitioners feel is best served by humanitarian professionals and not always best served by militaries or governments, other actors whose primary purpose is not humanitarian assistance. Again, happy to elaborate that on Q&A if you like. EOC, Emergency Operations Centres, really something that had come into being the last few decades as a worthy investment. I still question whether the expense of maintaining an EOC that is justified given other opportunities to spend money on disaster preparedness and the general overall lack of global funding for preparedness. That said, they perform very important functions around analysis, which is often lacking. In a major disaster, we tend to go from rapid assessment to response without often taking much time to do analysis. And that can be at times wasteful and inefficient. Sometimes it's pragmatic in terms of needing to work in a chaotic situation. But EOCs can, in very much using modern communication techniques and data sources, they can help to speed up the decision-making process. They can help to facilitate communication that might not be there otherwise. And they can help with sort of big data mapping hazards and threats and risks changes. So really invaluable to disaster preparedness, but expensive to maintain, and an opportunity cost exists there with scarce resources to be invested. Last point on this slide, a lot of time and effort is invested in peacetime planning and training around developing standard operating procedures, in developing tools and standards. You may have heard of the FEAR minimum standards for humanitarian response, or something which the little recent called core humanitarian standards. This is about establishing a level playing field between actors, make sure that everybody is providing roughly the same stuff in the same quantities, quality, that again doesn't exacerbate differences or divisions within the beneficiary community. It's an area that's highly driven by principles, and I think one that, again, is essential, but opportunity cost around how much time and effort is invested on that. Just a quick, I guess, reality check here. 90%, more than 90% of the disasters that occur in any one calendar year are small and medium scale. They don't make the news headlines. They don't make the attention of major humanitarian donors and funding mechanisms. And as a consequence, a lot of planning and training at country level tends to go into those small and medium scale disasters rather than planning for very large scale disasters or even planning for catastrophic level disasters that might affect an entire region or indeed the whole planet. Again, happy to talk a little bit more about that later on, time permitting. I'm going to show you now a slide around what I think is perhaps one of the most important challenges around humanitarian response, and it's about how we make decisions. In reality, decisions are often supply-driven humanitarian response rather than being needs-driven, and that's a bit of a legacy of slowness of assessment and the lack of sophistication of analysis of assessment data. So when I worked on the response to Cyclone Sidr in Bangladesh back in 2007, I think it was, 7 or 8, we dusted off the usual emergency appeal for Bangladesh, the same sort of items we provided for cyclone-affected communities previous years, what our starting point, or even a fairly strong bias in how we want to respond. We also looked at what we had in the warehouse. So we're going to program what's available in the warehouse rather than program purely around results of the new needs assessments are telling us. So that's a real risk in decision making, that you're going to take a cookie cutter approach, you stop the last appeal, you look at what's in your warehouse, and you're very much supply driven. Needs assessment and improved informatics could really help to make timely need-driven responses financially viable. There's also a lot of secondary data analysis that tended to influence decision-making in the past rather than primary. But again, with new innovations in technology, with communities being able to contribute information about their situation via a smartphone or social media in real time, we are moving to a situation where we're able to put a heavier reliance upon primary data rather than secondary data sources of analysis. Another key aspect around decision making is herding chickens or herding cats, which are used to working in decision making in peacetime. So major decisions around disaster response operations need to involve senior level governance, be that at state level or within an organisation like the Red Cross. They need to involve senior level management and, of course, operational level decision makers. The next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different space that those people are in, but suffice it to say here that people working in those different roles have very different frames for making decisions in peacetime. They often bring that same framework into crisis disaster. That creates an impediment to timely and effective decision making. A little case in point, I was in Nepal recently evaluating the earthquake from 2015, the response of the Nepal Red Cross. I spoke to the chairman of the Nepal Red Cross and said, well, what did you do when the earthquake struck? And he said, I started tidying my room in my house, and I felt that I was overwhelmed when the telephone rang and said, don't you think you should come to the office? Don't you think you should be activating the EFC? His initial response was, it's a Sunday, let's do that tomorrow. And it took him about half an hour, he said, before he was able to shift his mindset into a different way of working. And he went down to the office and he called his staff in and they started responding. But he was not able to quickly switch decision-making domains. That's really what happens consistently across disasters. People tend to perceive the initial disaster to actually be less than it is, to want it to be less of an impact so that it's more manageable, less stressful, less resource intensive. It's an interesting psychological impact, one that we try to overcome very quickly through training emergency response leaders. The last point there very quickly, the CNN effect and the politicization of aid. So irrespective of what the humanitarian needs are, the funding that becomes available for response is very much driven by where it is happening in the world. Is the state one which is perceived being politically friendly to major donor societies? Are there cultural ties? Is there a strong diaspora from that country? Does that country have resources which are attractive, which need to be safeguarded? A lot of these fairly cynical issues come to play in terms of how generous or otherwise donors are going to be in responding to a crisis. And it weighs heavily in the minds of response decision makers. Should we be asking for 100 million? Is 100 million unrealistic? Should we be asking only for 10 million? If we ask for that 100 million, do we raise unreasonable expectations and create difficulty for our partners? Or are we sending a message to donors that they're underestimating the needs yet and it needs to be a bigger response? Those questions are often debated at headquarters very quickly after disaster. Decisions are made based on political gut instincts. As horrible as it sounds, it's realistic in terms of which countries or which affected people are going to receive more or less humanitarian assistance. It's quite a fickle business. If you look at the distribution of humanitarian aid against need, you find a pretty complicated and hard to justify picture. Moving on, and this is probably one for further reference rather than to discuss it in any depth here, a framework that I find particularly useful in training senior disaster responders and even in reflecting on their role in disaster response is an Evan framework. It's a Welsh word. It means place of your multiple belongings, or realizing that there are many different pieces or decision-making frameworks that impact you at one time and can't possibly know all the influences consciously. It's a decision-making framework or sense-making model. It's not about categorizing disasters into one of the boxes. It talks about domains and systems within which we exercise decision-making. So depending on which space you're in, you would need to act differently. And the central space disorder is not knowing which domain you are in. And there's a danger, I mentioned this before, that you default to your personal preference. So for example, looking at the Paul and that senior government member, his day-to-day work rested in the domains of simple and complicated. So he was used to using cause-effect models, being able to apply standard operating procedures, occasionally needing to do a little bit more analysis and thinking. But it wasn't the domain that the earthquake placed every year. The earthquake, or any major humanitarian disaster, tends to be chaotic. And you tend to need to be able to act first without being able to do your analysis or use standard operating procedures to stabilize the situation. And once the situation becomes somewhat stabilized, you're able to look at the complexity and to look at what approaches emerging, what's working and what's not working, and then bring it back into complicated to say, well, perhaps we can model this or scale up that particular pilot project which is working well and be able to normalise the situation. A really good example here is the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where the scale and the nature of the disaster was so much out of everybody's radar screen that people are left wanting, knowing what to do. They didn't have the experience, tool, the mindset to be able to act when chaos descended. And that, again, it resulted in quite a lot of denial. There was several months of denial of the scope of the problem at the beginning, and that actually led to a worsened situation. There was an attempt to respond in traditional ways, where we were seeing the distribution of relief items not really being effective. What was necessary in the Ebola outbreak was a change in mindset, was social mobilisation to get people to change burial practices. It was a response where a humanitarian response like the Cross needed to actually manage dead bodies. In areas that we hadn't worked in before, it was act, then look at emergent practice, and then try to normalise and stabilise the situation before being able to systematise response. Again, fascinating area of work around the Connecticut framework. There's a really good 8-minute video on YouTube by the author of this, a guy called Dave Snowden. Highly recommend you watch that 8-minute video if you get the chance to understand the decision-making frameworks as they apply in major disasters and crises. And I'm going to speed up and finish off in a few quick slides now. Reflections on logistics, and this sort of begs the question, isn't the solution to everything just good logistics? If we have good supply chain, we have stock available, isn't humanitarian response largely about what we used to say, trucking and tucking, getting relief items into the hands of people who need it as soon as possible? Interesting example from the Nepal earthquake, probably the best prepared contingency plans globally, most known hazard threat of major earthquake at the Kathmandu Valley, tens of millions invested in contingency plans, yet when the earthquake struck, it was for a scenario that they hadn't planned on. It was outside the Kathmandu Valley. It was about reaching hard-to-reach rural villages rather than a large urban population. The contingency plans called for pre-positioning of stocks. I'll share this with you, but don't put me on it. I evaluated Nepal Red Cross's readiness. Their own contingency plan said they could have had pre-positioned stocks, 50,000 households. In fact, they had stocks for less than 4,000 households. And that was, again, a lack of resources for disaster preparedness, despite having a really good contingency plan for a major disaster, lack of follow-up in implementing that contingency plan. Nepal has always been wary of challenges that are going to be there for supply chains. What if the airport is cut off? What if the landlines are cut off? Again, the worst case scenario played out. We had a very congested airport, very disrupted land lines from India, and port access was very poor. Bureaucracy around these in terms of unnecessary delays. So despite the fact that these hazards or challenges have been identified, very little had gone on in peacetime to resolve them. There was a lack of warehousing space. Every scrambled to find trucks in Kathmandu. Most of the NGOs were quicker than the Red Cross and the government at being able to procure trucks. Procurement procedures, again, this is a real startling finding within the Red Cross. The earthquake happened just before wet season, and there was a real urgent need to give people tarpaulins. In the Kathmandu Valley in particular, a lot of people were afraid to go back into their houses, were sleeping outside, it was raining, and they were banging on the gates of the Nepal Red Cross Society saying, "We need tarpaulin." Now, the choices open to the Red Cross were limited around to get those tarpaulins. To order the standard tarpaulins, which met sphere standards and would be shipped from a regular supplier and arriving country, we were looking between 6 weeks and 3 months for that to occur. which was completely unrealistic according to me. The small amount of contingency stocks was soon depleted, and what needed to happen, this is what others did, the rest didn't, was to go to the market to buy whatever stocks were available in Kathmandu, cheap Chinese plastic tarpaulins were substandard, and to distribute them in knowledge that something is better than nothing, and that by the time the good quality parts arrive, people will have at least had some temporary materials that they can use for sheltering during the days and weeks of aftershocks and the onset of monsoon. A lot of lessons learned around backing up seeking response people to go outside procedures, giving them the space to make decisions that don't reflect globally agreed standards in the face of unsurmountable humanitarian need. Last reflection on logistics, West Africa Ebola outbreak. A lot of the items that were needed there were things that we didn't normally stock. Personal protective equipment, PPE, was in global shortage. Everybody scrambled to try and procure as much as possible. There was real limitation on that, and agencies who were running all the treatment centres really struggled to maintain a solid pipeline on PPE. The response itself, not so much about giving people items. It wasn't about tarpaulins or jerry cans or food or water sanitation support. It was about behaviour change. It was about stop practices which were leading to the rapid transmission of Ebola between family members and community groups. So it was much more about social mobilisation, about information, communication, and that's where we really focused as the Red Cross movement at the time. So the nature of response wasn't a commodity-driven response. It was very much a communication, behavioural-driven response. So interesting learning there. I'm going to move last two slides, Ed, and then we can go to questions if there's time permitting. Appropriate and innovative technologies. I'm going to be brief on this. My experience over the last couple of decades is that they're very rarely needs-driven. They're much more supply-driven. So I would get approached by a company which is the new water filter, or a company which is selling drones and saying, look, we think you can use this, rather than the other way around, sort of saying, where are the gaps in technology and innovation that used to be based on needs and based on the experience of disasters in these countries. So there's a word of caution there around being supply-driven around tech rather than needs-driven, and looking at where innovation can speed up the process. Good practice, building up existing capacities and network. We've seen text messaging working really well, WhatsApp, social media around communicating needs from communities to responders in real time. Some of this has been turned into some really interesting heat maps and other ways of graphically representing data. American Red Cross has done some interesting work on that nationally. Assessment versus analysis, I touched on this before. Technology that can help rapidly bring together different streams of data and make sense of them is rapidly needed. What has happened in the past is that the needs assessments tended to be a paper-based notebook that tended to be a lengthy process of getting observations from the field into some sort of database system that could process information in a timely manner. Smartphones, of course, revolutionising that and speeding it up. And most communities that are affected by disasters have a high proportion of people with access to smartphones. That's really something that has come into the forefront of humanitarian response. An interesting reflection here, you'll all be familiar with the massive migration emergency we had out of Syria and North Africa into Europe over the last couple of summers. One of the highest priority needs people who were in transit between countries was internet connectivity. They wanted to be able to communicate with family or community members elsewhere along the pathway of transition from Syria or North Africa to destination countries. So whenever they could come to a town or cross a border, one of the first things they would ask the Red Cross for is credit for their mobile phone or internet connectivity, and also looking to the Red Cross to provide reliable information. There was a lot of fake news out there, a lot of data that was not accurate, that was being reported on in the press, that needed to be verified or validated through a third party like the Red Cross or like the other NGO corresponding. So connectivity is really becoming a high priority need, especially when families are separated. Others quickly worth mentioning, cash transfer programming has really revolutionised response in recent years, getting away from stockpiling, procuring relief items to looking, particularly in small and medium-scale disasters, what items are available in the market, what can cash purchase in a national context or local context that can have other benefits for an economy rather than bringing in duty-free relief items from outside the country. Of course, it needs to be on the basis of information, are markets functioning and are the items available in country, but where they are, cash transfer programming can be quicker, more dignified and more cost-effective traditional logistics. Lastly, there's been a revolution in innovation around monitoring and evaluation, particularly beneficiary complaints and feedback mechanisms. I was talking to, I think it was a World Vision a couple of months ago in Haiti, where they put a QR code on the sides of their relief items, which community members could scan with their phone and immediately give feedback on the suitability of the items in the kit. And that was providing some really interesting real-time feedback, anonymous feedback on the suitability of the relief items being supplied. Again, the endless opportunities there for more timely information collection and analysis. The last slide, and then I'll throw back to you, Ed. There's a wealth of information at the moment around emergency funding mechanisms. Ed asked me to talk a little bit about the DREF, but I'll raise that in the context of pooled funding. It makes sense to have a pot of money available that you can dip into very quickly when there's a disaster to be able to immediately finance response activities rather than having to go through the more lengthy peacetime process of writing a proposal, shopping it out to donors and getting to sign a contract. So the Red Cross has had great success with DREF. Again, about 90% of emergencies for the Red Cross are small and medium scale, which we use DREF for. There's a big one who's DREF to give a quick loan to an emergency operation to get up and running. The UN has something called the CERP, which is worth looking if you have more time. Emergency funding, I've mentioned this a couple of times. There's dearth of funding generally. In any calendar year, there tends to be only about 60% of the funds that are needed that are actually available. So the UN appeals, the Red Cross appeal, globally, annually only raise about 60% of the money we say we need to respond. And if you look at disaster preparedness kits, you're looking at an even lower percentage, perhaps 10% or less. That said, there's been some good benefit analysis done on resourcing for disaster preparedness versus response. The Red Cross would argue that every $1 spent on disaster preparedness can save you $10 on response or even more. The reality is that the funding decision around those pots of money for disaster preparedness and pots of money for response are vastly different. So just as we need to look at the Evans framework around how we respond, donors also respond very differently in chaos. They want to act immediately and they make funds available much more quickly and with much less baggage attached than they do during peacetime or they do during simple, complicated decision-making domains. Very quickly, forecast-based financing, that's about looking at predictable climatological disasters, so hurricane seasons, storms and floods, and making funding available in advance of a wet season or advance of a predicted drought to lead to response that can then be smaller, more predictable and manageable. Start Fund, again, if you have interest, Google Smart Fund. They're doing some interesting research looking at the role of IGOs in blockchain for validating transactions. They're looking at trust funds and insurance and other mechanisms for funding humanitarian work in recognition of this massive gap that exists. And from a more formal background, the OECD's got an interesting paper, a good reference that Rachel Scott, making humanitarian finance fit for the future. A read if you have interest. Ed, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for indulging the time slides. Happy to get questions or discussion if we have any time left.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions, and I'll repeat them if we need to make them louder.
Brilliant.
Questions for Simon? Simon, one of those, we studied the Fukushima disaster. We actually had an exercise in one of our classes about it.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what your observations were during that disaster, since you were on the scene?
Yeah, it was a very interesting disaster in that we tend to think that disasters primarily happen in developing countries rather than in developed country contexts. And despite the fact that the Japanese government was not asking for international financial assistance, they received billions of dollars and hundreds, I think more than 100 billion through the Red Cross alone in unsolicited expressions of solidarity. And it became a challenge for the Red Cross to manage that money. The standards didn't apply, so the sphere standards which we normally use for determining what sort of items people should receive didn't really apply. So, for example, the Red Cross money bought people containerised temporary accommodation and a white box package, including a dishwasher or a refrigerator, etc., rather than the kind of things we'd normally be providing for people affected by disaster in Croatia or elsewhere. One of the biggest shocks, I guess, for me was a very candid discussion I had with prefecture authorities near Fukushima around why so many people had died and why people had reacted the way they did. And what had typically happened is that people heard the sirens and they got in their cars or they moved to evacuation centres, which were, for pragmatism's sake, built around a scenario of a wave of less than 4 to 5 metres. So the government had decided in doing its contingency planning that we can't really plan for a really big wave because that would require investments in infrastructure that are unrealistic for us in the current economic climate. So let's just plan for the more likely scenario of a 4 or 5 metre wave. So many people who evacuated to the second story of a building or the third story of a building were wiped out when we hit the 40-metre wave. And it goes to show, I think this really applies also to the whole realm of catastrophic event, that it's just not feasible for many states to realistically plan for a really large-scale disaster. They are much more focused in their disaster preparedness around small and medium-scale disasters, and they tend to not really do much when it comes to global killers. I mean, perhaps an interesting case in point of this is also global preparedness flu pandemic. We had many years ago a real heightened sense of planning around swine flu, bird flu. That's all disappeared now, the lessons have been lost. Yet the threat of the global pandemic is still there, but to be able to sustain the level of planning and investment in infrastructure necessary, the money's just not there.
Okay. Follow-up question on that?
They're a real lively bunch, Ed.
We've got them just before break, Simon. So
yeah.
And it's 7:15 in the evening here. A little bit earlier there. What about, so we also studied in class I think last week, we studied on the Ebola crisis.
Great.
What were the key things that was so different about that disaster?
Again, I think we all feared the potential for a large regional or even a global Ebola outbreak. I worked on the Ebola outbreak in Uganda back in 2000, and there was always some hysteria that this would be weaponized. It would travel to the west via expatriates or communities moving around, and that this would be major panic. So again, when Ebola started emerging in West Africa in peri-urban areas, this was the kind of fear and scenario that was being talked up. And I remember colleagues in the Red Cross really frustrated that they couldn't get a serious audience or reaction from many of the states and even from the UN system and the other NGOs. Everybody was wanting this to go away or was expecting it to be about like previous occurrences in remote rural areas had. So, you know, this natural complacency or a desire to refer to your default position until such time as the scale of the threat or the scale of the disaster is evident is a real challenge. So I remember again, it took, within the Red Cross movement, it took the visit of the Secretary General of Africa before the Red Cross started taking the response to the scale that was necessary and really advocating. Their response itself, well, it was startling because our traditional approaches didn't work. That the social mobilization that we normally do, the raising awareness about sanitation and hygiene, etc., were not really being taken seriously by the communities. And a lot of the communities were skeptical of the role of IPOs and the role of government. They were in denial. There was a lot of death happening that was linked up to cultural practices around burial that they were unwilling to give up on. So the rational response that we might expect in some other parts of the world, had this outbreak occurred there, was lacking in the communities because of the pre-existing political lack of political capital, I guess, that existed there. And it took a long time for people to change. I remember very early on we sent in an anthropologist to start looking at some of this as to why we weren't getting the same purchase in the community. And I think more needs to be done around looking at, again, decision-making frameworks and community resistance to anything in many regards that comes from authority, particularly in crisis-affected communities or in remote and inaccessible communities throughout developing world.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions? Simon, can we send you questions via email if we have some after?
Yeah, please do. I've got my email up on that last slide.
Great.
So if anyone's interested in something I said and they want more information, or indeed something I didn't cover but you think I might be able to answer, I'm happy to take any questions over the next few days. Super.
It's great to hear your voice again. Thank you for joining us and for giving us your insights.
And you, Ed.
Thank you. It's and great best wishes for the holidays.
And to you, and good luck to the students. I hope to see them out there in the field getting their hands dirty before long.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. Take care.
All the best. Cheers.